Hello, and welcome to the Disability Conference. I'm so pleased to have been asked to provide a presentation for you. I presented last year at the Disability Conference. It was an absolute pleasure to be involved, and I'm so glad to be able to do it again. I would like to, of course, thank the committee for putting together the Disability Conference. It's always just so well done, such a great asset to the community, and I'm pleased to be a part of it. Many thanks to Dean Pellegrino for her continued leadership over the years for putting on this disability conference. And many thanks to Dr. Dalgan and Dr. Brook for doing all of the background work, along with a host of other people who have really done a fantastic job to make sure that all of this goes off without a hitch. And so, again, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this. My name is Dr. Michael Kelley. I'm a professor here at the University of Scranton. I'm the director of the Applied Behavior Analysis programs. The program is hosted by the Counseling and Human Services Department, which of course lies in the Punisco College of Professional Studies. So the topic of my presentation today is what's called Science is the Secret Ingredient for Effective Intervention. And I added the subtitle here, In Pursuit of Ethical Treatment. And the reason I did that is one of the core features of behavior analysis as a science, which translates into practice, is a reliance on empirically validated assessment and intervention. In terms of practice, behavior analysts are obligated by the ethical codes in our field to only use assessments and interventions that have been empirically validated. This is similar to medicine, psychology, social work, any of these other helping fields in which there's a regulatory body, right, like a state board that guides the practice. It's no different for behavior analysis. It's no different for serving those living with autism or other disabilities. And so from my end, as a licensed psychologist and as a behavior analyst, I am focused on how we can continue to improve not just what we do in our practice, but how we can educate others and inform others about what is the best way to pursue ethical treatment. And the angle that I chose for today's presentation is science. All right, so much of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be in the context of autism, but it's not specific to autism, right? This is my specialty, behavior analysis, psychology, and autism, but everything I'm going to talk about applies more broadly to those living with other disabilities, whether related to autism or not. Because the goal is the same, right? We want to have effective and ethical intervention available. And so think about that as I'm talking about autism, that this is not just specific to autism. But specific to autism, it's a complex disorder, right? And so when you look at the symptom profile in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, you have deficits in language, social communication, and then there's behavioral excesses, right? Repetitive behavior, restricted interest in activities, compulsive-like behavior. And so the sort of prototypical individual living with autism will have either no language or some language or lots of language that has features to it that's consistent with the diagnostic criteria, but there'll be deficits in the capacity to engage socially. And then, of course, the presence of these repetitive behaviors, restricted interests. And it's called autism spectrum disorder for a reason. Individuals who are diagnosed with autism will show great variety in deficits and excesses. And then when you're talking about individuals who have other sorts of disabilities, it gets even more diverse and more varied. And so because of the complex nature of autism, and of course, the complex nature of all disabilities, a very wide range of interventions has emerged over time, not just across fields of, say, medicine, occupational therapy, behavior analysis, psychology, social work, but even within fields. And so specific to autism, if parents were to do a Google search, or if caregivers were to talk to practitioners about, well, what are some options for intervention for symptoms of autism, and you will come up with a dizzying array of options. A dizzying array, right? If you go to Google right now and type in something like autism intervention, I think my bet for over under would be something like 70 million results or something like that. Maybe 100 million, I don't know. And so how are you supposed to figure out what's supported, what's going to work? It's hard, right? So some common, and I'll call them interventions, right? Because that's what people call them. But of course, we would save that word for something that has scientific proof of efficacy. But some of the things you might come across are things like sensory integration, facilitated communication, ABA, music therapy, medication strategies, different diets, vitamin therapy. And the question is, well, how do you know what of these interventions have empirical support? Specific, right? To fixing the problems that someone's complaining about, for ameliorating the symptoms of autism or other disabilities. Well, it turns out the most have limited or no evidence or even counter evidence to support their use. And of course, it's all linked to money. Multi-billion-dollar a year business offering interventions for symptoms of autism and other disabilities. The fact of the matter is, many of these interventions, they persist, right? People still pay for them. People still deliver them, even though there's either a dearth of scientific evidence, or again, even scientific evidence that would support not using the treatments. They persist, they keep going. And so, why is that? Well, here's 4 reasons, potential reasons. There's more, but I'm going to go through these one at a time to sort of help us understand why these would persist. So first of all, there's an urgent desire to solve a problem right here and right now. And I understand that. I understand that. So one of the things I think about when I practice as a psychologist, you hear time and time and time again that parents will say, I'm on 3 or 4 or 6 wait lists to get a diagnostic evaluation, and that the wait time for each of those wait lists is something like 6, 9, 12, 18, 36 months. Now, I don't know about you, but like if I call the dentist or I call my primary physician, and if I don't have an appointment within like a couple days, I'm starting to look for somebody else. I'm not going to wait 6 months for a cleaning or if I'm sick to go to the doctor. But the fact of the matter is, there's not just someone down the street to call who doesn't have a wait list usually, right? And the problem is urgent. Problems need to be solved right now, especially when you're talking about, well, this is my near and dear to my own heart, especially if you're talking about children suffering, or a situation where you have a 2 or 3-year-old who's showing clear signs, clear symptoms of autism, and that kid can't get into intervention without an assessment. And you know that you're missing critically important time. It's urgent to act right now. So getting into a diagnostic, getting into an intervention, and then when you actually get the established treatment, it can take a long time to show effects. So just real quickly, the first study that was published showing specifically the efficacy of ABA therapy for symptoms of autism was published in 1987. And those results have been replicated dozens and dozens of times since then. And those results have driven the practice for decades now. And what the data showed is that if you can diagnose a child with autism between the ages of 2 years and 4 years, it's pretty early, and then implement the right treatment at the right dosage for the right amount of time. And that's the key thing, the right amount of time is typically 2 to 4 years. So a kid starts treatment between the ages of 2 and 4, and then gets treatment for 2 to 4 years. So now you're starting to make judgments about how well did that treatment work by a child is entering first grade. It's a long time. It's a long time for someone to wait. So it's really tempting, right? To say, I'm going to try a treatment right here, right now, because someone is telling me it's going to work fast. It's going to solve my problem right now. I don't have to wait 2 to 4 years to get results. So, for example, here, what would you do? You're a parent. You can't tell the difference between scientific evidence for these different options, and we're talking about 25 to 40 hours a week for years to try to eliminate symptoms of autism versus take a pill and your problem's going to go away tomorrow. As a parent, what would you be tempted to do? It's quite obvious. So a great example here is the hyperbaric oxygen therapy that has been for years making the rounds in the autism community. And so just take a look here about how much money it'll cost a parent or a caregiver, how much money someone will make. And the promise is near instantaneous improvement in symptoms. So let's say it works, let's say it doesn't work, right? You can see the financial interest that those who are providing this service have in such a service being seen as efficacious. It's a ton of money. Okay. So what about interventions for individuals with autism, right? So most experts agree that it's going to take some time, and a multidisciplinary assessment and intervention approach that involves therapy, and as school becomes an issue for when the kids advance to school age, special education and behavioral management. And the whole idea, to use sort of a combination of like lay language and the language of schools, is you want children to reach their full potentials and to maximize success educationally, socially, occupationally. And in terms of the different options from a mainstream classroom in a local school and then on to more restrictive environments, the goal would be to have a child in the least restrictive environment that was appropriate for that individual's needs. That's what I would want as a parent. And so that's what I would try to achieve with anyone whom I'm serving. And usually these developmentally appropriate intervention strategies would include, for sure, a language-based curriculum. And that's, for me, that's the number one thing. So day one, and it's like a little hint to make programs more effective. Day one, you want to assess the extent to which an individual can imitate sounds that someone else makes and imitate actions that someone else does. And so if you can show that an individual has a skill to imitate sounds, even if they're not words or even sophisticated sounds, like if I say, buh, and the individual responds with buh, you have the basics to develop a language-based curriculum. And if you can show that when you say, do this, that the individual watches and then does it, you have the basics for producing all sorts of other skills that will lead into pre-academic and then lead into academic skills. And then, of course, interventions to improve communication and social skills will go hand in hand with the language-based curriculum. And then, of course, if there's the emergence of any sorts of problem behavior or maladaptive behavior, then you'd want a strategy in place to be able to handle that as well, of course. Okay. So one of the things that we should do as practitioners is to make sure that we are familiar with not just the interventions that we do, and of course, with those interventions, you'll be intimately familiar, but that you're aware of sort of what else is going on. You at least need to have an awareness of those things. And there's good rationale for that, right? So if you're going to use certain interventions and then either reject the use in your own practice or you're going to guide people to not use certain practices, there's good reasons that you ought to know about those other things, right? So if you're going to try to convince other people and you don't understand those interventions, then you're not in a strong position to help guide people. There's also a distinction between if there's no evidence for some purported intervention, that doesn't mean that there's evidence against it. And there's a distinction there. And it's important to note that and to understand that. And then there's times where you can have a non-traditional intervention, but it certainly could have beneficial effects that have nothing to do with solving problems of autism or other disabilities, but could have good effects. And that, of course, that could lead to some confusion for sure. So if we're going to be in a really strong position as either professionals who are going to make recommendations about interventions, or a parent or caregiver who's going to make a choice about what to do with your child or or a caregiver making a choice for a child or teacher, whomever, you have to be informed, be an informed consumer. And we're in an age where people will say, I did my own research, and although I'm not super interested in kind of drawing lines of fracture politically at all in this kind of context, I can assure you, as someone who went to undergraduate and then 6 years of graduate school and a pre-doctoral internship and a postdoctoral, 2 postdoctoral fellowships and 20 years of practice, that there's a really big difference between being a multi-decade student of these areas and a multi-decade consumer of science and a multi-decade contributor to science. That there's a really big difference between professionals who are engaged with practice and people who are not. And sort of one of the memes you'll see on Facebook or whatever is, your Google search doesn't replace my 8 or 10 or 12 years of education. And it's, it's meant to be funny and insult people. But it's sort of true as well, right? And so it is important for parents and caregivers to do their best to be able to research these different treatments. But you really do have to rely on professionals who are intimately aware of all the different options and what the science supports and doesn't support. And so what can you do as a consumer? Well, you can read the literature. You can find someone to read it for you. The problem is the literature is usually extremely scientifically oriented and difficult to understand, even for other scientists reading something outside of their field. But things to look for are scientific evidence of a benefit, evidence of what the health risks are, what is the time commitment and the costs. Or you can go to trusted sites that will sort of done that for you. So for autism, you can go to this website here, the Association for Science in Autism Treatment, and they've already culled all that information for you. And it's the same thing, right? If you're interested in, I want to know what interventions are out there for cardiovascular health, you could go to the American Heart Association and on, right? There's places where their job is to help inform consumers of what the science is. And of course, you want to hope that there's not an agenda behind that. And largely, scientists don't have an agenda behind what they support. You also, though, have to critically evaluate interventions that you try. And so there's specific ways to design the implementation of an intervention that can give you information to know if what you're doing is working or not. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so purpose here. We're going to review some of the primary behavioral and non-behavioral treatments that you'll come across when looking for interventions for autism. And then we're going to look a little bit about what there is out there that supports or doesn't support it. And this will give you a really good sense of what is supported and what isn't, but also a sense of what goes into figuring these things out, and a sense of what kind of commitments professionals have to placing consumers in a stronger position to be able to make good choices about interventions. So let's start with some of the behavioral treatments for autism. I have applied behavior analysis bolded because, well, that's what I do. And I am a board certified behavior analyst at the doctoral level. It's my wheelhouse. So there it is in bold. Generally speaking, ABA is a science that has had the science translated into procedures and protocols to help solve problems of social significance. ABA doesn't just address symptoms of autism, but it does a really darn good job at addressing symptoms of autism. And so it can be used for a variety of things, right? Strengthening skills like language, communication, pre-academic, academic skills, functional skills like activities of daily living. Can be used to decrease behaviors like disruptive behaviors, teaching replacement skills, reducing other of the behavioral excesses that are consistent with a diagnosis of autism. And then, of course, you can use cognitive behavioral therapy, which is widely and appropriately used, especially for what we would call like higher functioning individuals living with autism, especially if they're reporting symptoms of comorbid disorders such as anxiety, right, or anger management and things like that. And there's evidence out there that individuals with autism and other disabilities as well are good responders to these sorts of treatments, just like anybody else would be, just like anybody else. Now, I want to note that I started with the treatments that have the most voluminous and the strongest scientific data supporting their use. And I can't emphasize enough that for applied behavior analysis, there's over a 50-year literature showing how efficacious it is for solving these sorts of problems. There's no other treatment modality that has that kind of track record. I can't emphasize that enough. Now, as we talked about, autism and of course other disabilities are often associated with significant behavioral communication deficits and behavioral excesses, and require a team approach and multiple specialized interventions. And again, that's to produce the very best outcomes that we can hope for, right? Reaching potential. One of the reasons we can feel really confident about using ABA is because, like I said, it's one of the few empirically supported interventions out there. And I'm going to review a little bit of the National Standards Report for Autism Treatment, which looked at multiple modalities and drew conclusions based on the available scientific evidence. But you can also look at things like the New York Surgeon General, the Centers for Disease Control, the NEA, National Education Association, and on and on, that all support the use of applied behavior analysis for ameliorating the symptoms of autism. But of course, we know it's a spectrum, right? And so if two individuals have a diagnosis of autism, their interventions will not look the same. I mean, they'll fundamentally be based on some of the same principles, but they're going to look different because the presentation of the symptoms is really different. And so one of the limitations of ABA and one of the deficits sometimes of practitioners that we as scientists and trainers try to fix is if ABA is used inflexibly, because it's not supposed to be used inflexibly, it's supposed to be used very flexibly. And so discrete trial instruction is absolutely appropriate for some children diagnosed with autism and other developmental disabilities, but it's not appropriate for everybody. It's foolish to apply discrete trial instruction for certain individuals with certain deficit profiles. It doesn't make sense. It's like giving someone the wrong medicine. It's not going to fix the problem. All right, let's talk a little bit about the non-behavioral intervention options here. So some have been subjected to scientific scrutiny. Most are based on literally anecdotal reports, right? Word of mouth, parent groups, professionals that sort of make available whatever the intervention is. And then we can divide them further into these non-behavioral treatments into non-biological interventions like sensory integration, and then biologically based, which are medications and diets. All right, so we're going to get into some of these really commonly recommended non-biological interventions. So we'll go through these kind of one by one. So let's start with sensory integration therapy. So no doubt, lots of individuals diagnosed with autism and other disabilities show sensitivity to things like noises or being overstimulated in an environment where there's lots of things going on. And we sort of loosely put that under the umbrella of having sensory issues or something like that, right? And so sensory integration therapy is designed to ameliorate those symptoms related to sensory issues. And certainly there's a scientific literature that supports that individuals with autism can oftentimes be more susceptible to having either hypo or hyper responsiveness to sensory input, again, like noises or lights or whatever it might be. And that there's a relationship between this hypo or hyper responsiveness to things like stereotypic behavior, rigid behavior, repetitive behavior. There's published literature that shows that. And so the general hypothesis, I misspelled hypothesis there, is that when you use these integration techniques, right, pressure touch, the weighted vests, things like that, that they can facilitate attention, they can bring a focus of awareness and reduce arousal, right? That's the hypothesis on how these therapies work. Oh yeah, deep pressure massage, joint compression, vestibular interventions like either vibrators or swinging, tight hugs, things like that. The problem here is that it all makes incredible intuitive sense. It is so intuitive to use therapies in this way to counter hypo or hyper responsiveness to sensory input. The problem is there's like nothing out there on systematic controlled research on these different modalities of sensory integration. And again, there's a difference between a therapy that is enjoyable, that someone likes, and a therapy that will address the symptoms of autism. And so if an individual with autism wears a weighted vest or gets a deep pressure massage or joint compression or whatever it might be, it's one thing if the individual cooperates with that and likes that or seeks it out. And it's a whole nother thing to assess, well, did that variable actually address the symptoms of autism? And there's not controlled systematic research out there to show that. All right, animal-assisted therapy, right? So people report, again, therapies that involve animals to help, hippotherapy, dolphin therapy, there's others as well. And again, these can have absolutely incredible beneficial effects. So if an individual with autism will focus and enjoy riding a horse and learn a new skill, or if a therapy dog provides an individual with autism to bond with an animal and then perhaps even share that enjoyment with others, that's great. I'm totally in support of those things. The question is, how do those interventions systematically help with the symptoms of autism? And that's the key thing we always want to be focused on. Are we targeting the symptoms? And can we show that it's what we did that actually produced some amelioration of the symptoms of autism? All right, what about communication-based interventions? I'm going to go through these four, and I'm going to start with the most controversial here. So facilitated communication is, oops, sorry about this, is a strategy that was developed in the 70s in response to a true problem, right? So let's say there's individuals with significant language impairments, individuals say with cerebral palsy, and literally don't have the ability to control the musculature to communicate. Individuals with profound disabilities who cannot speak. It is important to find a way to produce, enhance, support communication with these individuals, no doubt. It's a critical need. And so facilitated communication training was developed with a facilitator, right? And so the strategy involves having a trained therapist facilitate the communication of the individual who does not have the communication repertoire. And it seemed like a miracle. So pause for a second. And of course, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. But it seemed like a miracle. All of a sudden, using facilitated communication training, it was shown that, well, allegedly shown, that people with profound disabilities who for years, a range of children to adults, had never communicated, never expressive communication, not in their repertoire. All of a sudden with a facilitator, you were getting extremely sophisticated communications. And the way the facilitation happened was like with a keyboard or with a board with letter selection. And the facilitator literally just kind of helped guide the person's hands, either to touch words or touch pictures or touch letters. Now, let's go back to the urgency of the matter and imagine that you're a parent of someone with profound disabilities who's never communicated. And someone told you we have a strategy that can unlock what you've not seen yet to set this person's language and communication free. I mean, what parent wouldn't want that? I mean, if that was true, I'd give everything I own to unlock that for my child. Wouldn't you? The problem is that as soon as science got their hands on it, it was thoroughly debunked. What the science showed in the first article was published in 1995 is that the facilitators were doing the communicating, not the individuals with autism or other developmental disabilities. And the way they proved that is they gave the facilitators either true information, false information, or no information about actual events. So imagine a child with autism had pancakes for breakfast, and the experimenters told the facilitator that the child had pancakes for breakfast and asked the facilitator to ask the child to communicate what they had for breakfast. In this case here, the child would say pancakes. And they gave the facilitator false information and said the child had pancakes for breakfast, but really the child had French toast for breakfast. Well, when the facilitator asked the child what the child had for breakfast, the child reported pancakes, right? What the facilitator was told, not what the child actually ate. And when they didn't give the facilitator any information at all, the answer was never right. So the only time the answers match is when the facilitator was given true information and not when it was false information or no information. And so tragically, what we learned is that facilitated communication did not unlock this language that was locked away. It was a false treatment. It didn't do what it said it did. And you can go to Google and look up facilitated communication. There's actually a fascinating case called it's called The Curious Case of Anne Stubblefield, and shows you some of the potential tragic outcomes when people are committed to using interventions that are not scientifically supported. All right, next, PECS, Picture Exchange Communication System. It's a visually based system that is designed to help individuals start communicating, right? Starts with exchanging pictures of items that are desired. Something as simple as you have a picture of a toy train and a picture of an Oreo and a picture of a drink, and you teach an individual to swap the picture for the actual thing. Of course, it gets much more complicated and complex than that. That's like the first phase, and there's 6 phases, and it's designed to produce increasingly more sophisticated communication. Now, this was developed in the 1970s. It's still in use in terms of its core features. But back when I was training, we literally had these like spiral notebooks with Velcro strips, and you could move the things around to communicate, and people still do use those. But of course, now we've moved to more electronic, more sophisticated technological strategies to implement such interventions. And there is research, by the way, showing that PECS produces communication in those who have limited communication repertoires. Sign language, right? So some individuals with autism are taught to use sign language. Again, you can teach different signs that mean something, right? And that someone understands, and then you can use that as a form to communicate. Now, we know sign language works for those who have hearing impairments. Of course, people can communicate with sign language. There's not as much research in the area for autism and other developmental disabilities. And there's sort of a good reason for that, right? So if you think about using something like PECS, where if an individual has a notepad or a 3-ring binder, and you walk into a store or you go to a different classroom and you hand someone a picture of a water fountain or a picture that says bathroom, please, everyone's going to know what that means, right? However, if you walk into a store or to another classroom and engage in sign language, odds are that most people won't understand that. And so this is called, the PECS is called a selection-based communication strategy, which I prefer to something like sign language if you're not actually using vocal speech, just because people in the community are more likely to recognize it and then be able to actually reinforce it so that it's likely to be used consistently by those with autism or other disabilities. And then, of course, there's technology, right? Voice output communication aids or VOCAs, and these are great. Again, these are selection-based strategies where you can touch on the different pictures, which will produce a vocal output consistent with what the picture is as a way to communicate. And again, these strategies have been shown to be effective in scientific literature. All right, let's talk about DIR, or the Developmental Individual Difference Relations-Based Model. And so you may have heard this called floor time, right? The Greenspan method. Child-directed play-based intervention. You want to really form these social interactions and use that as the basis for facilitating any sort of skill acquisition. And the really cool part about this is it has an amazing intuitive appeal, right? You're saying we're going to recreate the developmental process that every human is evolutionarily prepared for, and use that process to facilitate the skill acquisition. And look, it has so much intuitive appeal, right? If you're a parent and you think about when you had a baby who's starting to like get up on the belly and push up, you would get right on the floor with the baby and be nose to nose and make sounds, and then when the baby can sit up, you'll sit on the floor too and sit up and imitate and hold hands and play with toys, and you're right down on their level. And so what this approach does is it literally mimics that entirely developmentally appropriate way that parents and caregivers interact with young children. And the teacher or therapist is encouraged to engage that way, and also to sort of mimic the child's choice of activity. Let the child sort of choose the activity and build in the learning opportunities around that. You probably know what I'm going to say here, right? That even though this has intuitive appeal, there's not research that backs it up. And so it's not that the model necessarily is going to do any harm, but if it's not doing any good, you wouldn't want to use that as the primary strategy to ameliorate the symptoms that are being targeted. All right, let's move on to non-behavioral treatments. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these. I'm just going to kind of go through and highlight the different things. All right, I talked about the hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and we already saw how much it costs, how expensive it is, and then of course how lucrative it can be for those who are doing it. The idea is that the hyperbaric chamber will reduce inflammation in the brain and sort of restore more biologically appropriate conditions in the neurological system, and that will reduce symptoms of autism. And again, some intuitive appeal, right? Where hyperbaric oxygen therapy has been and is used to adjust inflammation in the brain. The question is, will it reduce symptoms of autism? And the answer is that the scientific literature does not support that. There's not a literature that supports hyperbaric oxygen therapy for reducing symptoms of autism. What about vitamin supplements, right? So the hypothesis here is that the individuals have vitamin deficiencies that are producing the symptoms of autism. And if you get the vitamins, then the symptoms go away. And so you may have heard of the vitamin B6, B12 shots, right? Vitamin C, vitamin A, and on and on. And again, you might have some beneficial effects due to having the right amount of vitamins and minerals in your body, but there's not a literature out there that supports the reduction of symptoms of autism as a function of these vitamin therapies. No support. Gluten-free, casein-free diets, right? The hypothesis here, it's the opioid excess theory of autism, right? That you've got impaired function and permeability in the GI system, the leaky gut syndrome, and that dysfunction means that you can get wheat, which is the gluten, or the milk products, which is casein, aren't well absorbed. And then this affects the neurological symptoms that are systems that end up producing the symptoms of autism, right? So that's sort of the hypothesis behind coming up with a gluten-free, casein-free diet. First of all, there's not even strong evidence that children with autism are more likely to have gluten sensitivity. And I know that's a widely believed thing. It's widely believed. It might feel shocking to some people, but there's conflicting information about whether individuals with autism are even statistically different than anybody else when it comes to gluten sensitivity. Not to mention, there's plenty of people with gluten sensitivity who are not diagnosed with autism. Many people say that they go on these diets and it turns out they have these huge gains. Parents, caregivers say that too. But remarkably, in the one double-blind study in which people didn't know what diets the kids were on, when people provided the data judging symptomology of autism, there was no relationship to being off of gluten and casein and improvements in symptoms of autism. No support. What about chelation, mercury detoxification, right? So here we believe that a child with autism has lots of toxic heavy metals, either from vaccinations or from the environment, and they can't get rid of it. And so this damages the brain, right? The neurological system, and the chelation is supposed to remove those heavy metals. I've known parents that have taken their children to like Poland and Russia to get these therapies, but there's no evidence that it does anything for ameliorating symptoms of autism. There's no scientific support of that. All right, so what about medications, right? The hypothesis here is that there's a chemical imbalance and you can correct that with some sort of medication, right? And so, for an example, individuals with autism often do stereotypic behavior that's associated with high levels of dopamine. If you can block the effects of dopamine, well, you should get decreases in stereotypic behavior. And so the problem is that, how there's inconsistency. So how can you tell when it's going to work? what's the difference between reducing stereotypy and having a general level of sedation where not just stereotypy decreases, but so do other behaviors, appropriate adaptive behaviors. And then there's not really good ways to measure this. And so the support out here is scant for the pharmacological interventions. And here's a list of some of the things that are used, right, for those who are diagnosed with autism. And again, other developmental disabilities as well. So what should we do, right? Big question, how do we know what works? I mean, I just gave you some information, but how do you know I'm not lying or that I'm just wrong? Well, one thing you could do is go to things like task forces and sort of conglomerations of scientists and organizations that put information together. And so the National Standards Report in 2009 and 2015, or the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder, are great sources, right? I'm going to just really quickly show you this. You can get access to these slides, and you can go to the website yourself. But just to give you an overview here, they have a comprehensive report on what's out there in the empirical literature, and they categorize it by established treatments that are go-to treatments, emerging treatments that have some evidence and look promising, and then unestablished treatments that don't have evidence or have counter evidence. And again, so these established treatments, we know they work, lots of controlled studies. The emerging have just a few studies, need more research, and then the unestablished, kind of use your own risk potential for harm. So here's I'm not going to read these to you, but you'll have these slides and you can sort of look at this. Here are established interventions for individuals under 22 years old, and you can look at the list here. And if someone's offering these to you and saying they're indicated, these are empirically supported. Same here for emerging interventions. That there are some evidence. It's potentially promising, but not as supported as the established treatments. And then here's the unestablished treatments. And essentially here, this is a really good guide, right? What should I do? What should I not do? And I'll tell parents all the time, right? Do first, with your time, your money, your energy, that which is scientifically supported. Put your heart and soul, your energy, your money, put it all into that. And then if there's time and money, and there's something that you say as a parent, I'll do anything to help my baby, then go ahead and do that. That's fine, as long as it's not going to be harmful. But as your majority time, effort, resource allocation and commitment, stick with the science. It's going to be your best bet for getting the best outcome. So I want to show you just a really quick few hypothetical examples of how we as scientists conduct the right kind of experiments to then pass on as established treatments. Right. So you have days here on your x-axis, right? 0 through 35, maladaptive behavior, responses per hour on the y-axis. Here's the baseline, meaning there's no treatment. And this is the rate of maladaptive behavior in the blue path. And here's the rate of appropriate requests in the purple path, right? You then put in a non-behavioral therapy and look what you get. Appropriate requests maintain stability and maladaptive behavior decreases. Right? This gives you good information of efficacy of this treatment, right? Appropriate behavior stays the same, maladaptive behavior goes down. That is a good thing. That's what you want. Here's an example of no effect, right? Here's your maladaptive behavior. Here's your appropriate behavior. You give some, say, medication. Appropriate behavior stays the same. That's great. It wasn't reduced. But look, there's no effect on the maladaptive behavior. This didn't work, right? We would not call this an efficacious treatment. right, check this out. Maladaptive behavior in the blue, appropriate behavior in the pink. You give medication and check it out. Medication produces a decrease in maladaptive behavior, but now adaptive behavior goes down. This gives you the idea that there's an overall sedation. And the maladaptive behavior might be significant enough that this is a good start. But as you can see, if you're just reducing the overall behavior, this treatment is not related to the actual symptom that you're trying to fix. So just some parting thoughts here, right? We want to be skeptical of everything, right? These are our babies we're trying to keep care of, right? We want to be skeptical if anything's unproven. We just want to be sure that we get the evidence we need before we use something, especially if there's going to be an opportunity cost where you're using one unproven treatment at the expense of not using a proven treatment. There's lots of ways to share information and be supportive, but to do that through reputable sources, such as ASAT or the national standards. And then you want to critically evaluate anything you use as an intervention, whether it's behavioral or non-behavioral. Be in a position to be able to show that your treatment worked. As practitioners, we need to be empathetic too, right? So I said this a couple times where I say, well, if it's my child, my baby who needs help, would I, do whatever it took? Yes, I would do that. Certainly. No question. And practitioners need to help guide people to make good decisions about providing care to those with autism and other disabilities, and not set up barriers. Why? Because we want to benefit society. We want to benefit their parents and their systems or teachers and the entire field. That's all trying to do the same thing. Improve the lives of those who are living with autism and other disabilities. Finally, following the science, right? It's the most direct path if you're going to have effective and ethical intervention, right? And again, like you guys know about the whole known knowns, Donald Rumsfeld, right? What do we know that we know, right? That means we know that we know about certain effective treatments. And then what do we know that we don't know, right? Promising treatments that need more evidence. And then what are the things that we don't know that we don't know? And this is what science does. We love it when there's an experiment that fails because you get 5 new ideas, things you never would have thought of. And that's the job of science, is to figure all that out so that eventually, when the science does its job and identifies effective treatments, then parents and caregivers are in a strong position to be able to use those effective treatments. We want to resist things that seem too good to be true, because they probably are. And then, of course, we need to learn to discriminate, right? Professionals who are dedicated to science versus individuals or businesses that are interested in selling products because they are different things. That ends my presentation. And so again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you're enjoying the disability conference. And feel free to reach out to me. I would enjoy to hear any of your thoughts or to have a conversation about anything we talked about today or anything else that you'd like to talk about. So thank you so much.